Hello. This will be the second in a series of stories of Daneland villages. This week we are in Sutton in West Sussex. Basically, the film is about the village houses in the year 2000, but the underlying story being my Sunday paper round 1947 to early 1952. The important theme, however, being the names of the people in the houses at that time. The first house of my Sunday paper round was Sutton End House, so that is where we will start. Sutton End. Sutton End House, Lieutenant Colonel Frank and Nancy Holland. At this time, Colonel Holland was manager of the racehorse breeding stables for the Duke and Duchess of Norfolk. Also, I think Lady Astor and Lady Irwin. Before that, he was estate agent for the Courthold estate in Burton Park. Not many in the county, I don't think, knew more about flowers and shrubs than Nancy Holland. They had the house built, or the I think it must have been in the 1920s, and laid out these lovely gardens. They used to open them one week's lovely wisteria there, and you'd open the gardens 1 week a month for charity. Of course, the father was head gardener there for 40 years. This is the south view of the house, which is now, of course, owned by Albert and Madame Rue. Joan and I lived in this flat when we first got married. It was about 5 years. We had the privilege of looking out over these lovely gardens. That was their kitchen window. Joan was able to pick sort of enormous Victoria plums through that window. It looked like the trees still grown quite well. See, they've got a water feature, and it's in the front of the house where the drive is now, because that used to be just a round lawn in the middle at the time I delivered the papers. This is going down towards the bungalows by the stream. There's a stream, there's a rail on the right, and it was there that there used to be a wooden footbridge. Of course, it used to be a ford at one time, going back years, but the footbridge was still there when we came. It was there for quite a number of years. There's the bungalows on the right-hand side. Was Mrs. Thornby and Mrs. Silwood. I remember Mrs. Silwood living there. And of course Fred and Margaret Andrews later. This is the rue beside the bungalows. Wild garlic sort of grows quite well there. And lovely bluebells too, and all sorts of wildflowers grows there in that rue. Of course, the bungalows was my home for 25 years. I think my parents must have been there for 50. Came there in 1938, Valentine's Day, with my sister Pat. There's their front door. That's a rather unusual shrub planted several years ago by my father, called a styrex. And it's originated from, I think, Japan or Korea. Mr. Carrington, a postman, there's a lovely yellow laburnum. Burnham rather. Postman from Storrington, from Pulborough rather, Mr. Carrington used to bring the Sunday papers to me. The old poorhouse, Major J.B. and Ruth Solomon, because he had a tannery factory in London, and during the war he was officer commanding the Sutton Home Guard platoon. Before that the LDV, the local defence volunteer, so he was one of the early ones to join up. And Ruth Solomon was, apart from many interests in the village, was WI president at the time. This rue going up towards Keaston Farm, I can remember bee orchids growing on there. This is the line into Keaston Farm. Of course, on that, where it's eroded on the left-hand side there, that's where there was a milk churn stand. Expressed areas used to go and pick the churns up from there. Keaston Farm, Mr. and Mrs. Hill and their son Eddie farmed that one. I remember Mr. Hill having a lovely black cart horse that he used to use to work on the farm. Daisy Francis Farm, Sutton End. Of course, she had about 5 cows and a bull, and chickens and things. And no water at one time. She used to walk across this field to the stream and fill her pails, 2 pails of water. She must have done it about 10 times a day, I think, and come back with a yoke, one on each side. Of course, she delivered milk into the village just the same way with the yoke until later when she had an old pram. She used to go out in the afternoons and her cows used to feed on the side of the roads there and sit there with her milking stool. The road there looks like 3 levels at the moment. It certainly was in better condition in those days. Sutton Hollow Cottages, Mrs. King used to live in the right-hand side, and next door the Ruffle family. They lost a son during the war. Of course, later on the Conturnan family come to live there. The bottom of Sutton Hollow, this is where Fred Andrews had a small dairy farm. Remember he had Dexter cattle, very small ones at one time. That's the remainder of his dung heap. And I've got his dung fork now. It was left, he gave it to my father left it to me. So and that other shed there was his milking parlour. As I said before, he had very small, at Sutton End one time, Dexter cattle, very small ones, black ones. There's the fork, whoops, I've got it. I was looking from the hollow down towards Daisy Francis Farm, as was. There it is, this better view. Sutton Hollow. These are the roots of the sort of giant oak trees that grow each side. Sheltered many a time under there on the way to school. That's the oak tree itself, one of them. Darsfield, this is rather a nice house. Miss Cohen was in there. I think there was 2 Miss Cohens at one time, but there was certainly just one when I delivered the Sunday papers. And of course later, Lady Harding Davis lived there. Nice French metal table. Little Popcroft, and Miss Thomas was the first one in there. She was in there at the time. And of course her brother, Dr. Thomas, lived in Popcroft itself. That's Popcroft. Shortlands, of course that was built in the 60s, that wasn't there, and it was built by Major J.B. Solomon. Baker's Cottage, 493 and 494, because it was 2 cottages. Remember a Polish baker, and there was a lot of bakers in there, a Polish baker, and then of course Mrs. Standen used to live in there. She worked in the village shop for many years. And in the other cottage, there was a Mrs. Smith, I think what her name was, and there was 2 old ladies there. There was affectionately known as Auntie Jane and Auntie Kate. That's where their door was on the side there. Just there. Rock Cottage, Mr. and Mrs. Clem Goodger and daughters Wynne and Doris, and next door was Mr. and Mrs. Dick Gardner. It was a family home of the Gardners. She used to run all the whist drives and that in the village, and quite a bit of work in the village. Rectory Gate Cottage, Mr. and Mrs. Eade on the left-hand side, and then Mr. and Mrs. Ratton, and then Mr. Rapson, Whiskers Rapson on the right-hand side. He was a local odd job man in Chimney Sweep. The new rectory, because that was built on the gardens of the part of the gardens of the old rectory, as it. The old rectory, well, the rectory as it was. Delivered papers there to the Reverend Daintree, and I believe also before that to the Reverend Walter W. March. It's a nice view of the front, the safe view of the old rectory. Old schoolhouse, never known a school teacher in there, but Mr. and Mrs. Perry, Donk Perry, who's lived in there, he used to deliver the daily papers in the district. We had a motorcycle and sidecar one time, and then an Austin B36 open top Austin, I think. He's enthusiastic sergeant major in the Sutton Home Guard platoon, and he built a lookout in the yew tree in the garden. There's the yew tree, in part of the lookout. His lookout post is still there, made of angle iron. There it is, look, there it is. You could sort of had a commanding view of the downs, where I suppose he could see if the enemy were landing, the Germans or whoever it was. Of course, not such a good view now because the trees have grown up. That's the downs. Bottom of School Lane. This is the nook. Mrs. Leggett, Snowy Leggett, lived in there. That's the nook. I think she was some sort of relation, if not aunt, to Jack and Hazel Clare, who lived next door in Honeysuckle Cottage. This is Honeysuckle Cottage. This is where they lived. Field House, of course that wasn't there, that's been built recently, but that field in fact was used by the school as a games field at one time. 7 Doors, or Heartsease as it was known. There was quite a number of different people in that house. I remember an American lady, Mrs. Balfour. Another new house been built in this. Well, this is where Mrs. Larson lives now at the end of this lane. This is a field. I remember a nice walnut tree in the corner of that field. It's looking down the school lane again. Now we're at the top of School Lane with the school. This is the school itself.
stone playground in the front, a bit the same as what it is today. There's a rather nice large acacia tree in the corner of the playground, which is still there. There's the tree. It's a rather nice bark on it. Here's the bark, the trunk. It's actually in flower at the moment. When you draw back to it, it's got great long thorns. So you can see them. You probably can see them there now on the branches there. It's an old window on one side of the school. I think there's a preservation order on that. It's rather a nice glass window. This is a safe view of the school. On the little hut on the right there, that one, that was the boys' loo. And on the left, which is sort of a summer's house now, was the girls. Yeah, that was the girls. Appropriate weather vane. This was the school orchard, in fact. Rather a nice view from here to the Downs. That's the flint wall of the school. It's rather nice, big large flints napped, and that's beautifully napped. It's looking safe towards the Downs from there. Harriet's was called Bark Hall. That was built by Dr. and Mrs. Ryle. They had 3 children. They were all doctors. One in fact was the Astronomer Royal at Cambridge. So he must have been Professor then, Anthony Ryle. Very talented family. Used to live at Glatting Farm at one time. And the ones who built the swimming pool there. That's been built. That garage has been built on the village pound. That was a pound where I think the stray animals and that was first been put at one time. Anyway, there was just old metal and bikes at the time. I've got many apart from my cycle from there. John the Baptist Church. Not too sure why we're going up there. I certainly didn't deliver papers there. This is the east end of the church. Looking at has been recently renovated, the stained window there in the brickwork round there. Although we've got the St George's flag now, flown on high days and Sundays. Where be that old blackbird too? Where oh where he be? He be up in yonder bush and I'll be after he. He be after I and I'll be after he. Change of season. We got towards to the church itself. There's a tomb there on the right. I think there's an inscription on there. I think there's a young girl, 33 months, named Mary. 1700 and something she was buried there. Seems rather sad. I don't know quite the story to that one. Rather like this tombstone above these snowdrops here. There's Luke Carver. There used to be a chick carver whose lengthman at Sutton Inn. That's when we used to have the verges cut in the ditches dug out. There's not much of that done these days. Tim Sandeman, the famous port and sherry producer and shipper. Robert Verrall and his wife. At one time, publican to the White Horse. Leslie Harland, of course, she's known as Mistress Sutton. He's on it. I think he was at one time. He's on every committee in the village except for WI. So they said. Then played the church on Sundays and manager of the shop. These lovely oak gates were made by Ken Francis. There you are. Look, he's still got his plate on the gate that he put on there. He used to live in one of the streets, Sutton, and he was carpenter joiner. He worked for Parham. Cycled from Sutton to Parham every day. It's a view looking at the Downs from the churchyard. Coming now round to the manor house, which I think was called Old Gates, and it was 3 cottages. The right hand side one, I think it's 599, was Ruby Phillips. There we are. That's the right hand side, and Ruby Phillips and her daughter Daphne and brother Len. And in the middle was Mr. and Mrs. Cramp. He was a builder, in fact, and he used to cycle every day to Midhurst until his later years, and then he got an auto cycle. On the left hand side of Mrs. Standen. Village shop and bakery. First Mr. and Mrs. Hare, who owned the shop, and then there was another manager. I can't think what his name was. I can't recall that, because then Mr. Harling was manager of White Box, which was Hillside House and Bungalow. Bungalow was new. Mr. and Mrs. Oliver Hall. Oliver Hall was a famous RA artist. And his son lived there afterwards, Claude Muncaster. He was an ARA, and he changed his name by deed poll so he wouldn't get mixed up with his famous father. And of course, Claude Muncaster's son, Martin, the BBC broadcaster, but he must have been. So this was their lovely view, and was an artist's view from the house. I don't do it quite justice at the moment, but obviously in the summer it's better. It's still a lovely view, looking towards Bignor Park. There we are, there's Bignor Park house through the trees. Brown's house, Rose Cottage as it was called, Ursula Wyndham of the Leconfield family. She lived there. She kept goats there in the garden and fed them alongside the verges and the road as well. She was an author. Well, she wrote at least one book. Hillview in Bud's cottage, that's right, because one was called Hillview, which the wheelwright widow, Mrs. Penfold, lived in Ernie Budd, the blacksmith, and his wife lived in the left-hand side. This is the footpath leading to Bignor Park. There used to be a rather nice sign on there at one time, or I thought it was anyway. It used to say, footpath leading to Park Lane. I don't know what happened to that. That's not a really good view looking south through the street. That's Hollybush Cottage. That's a new one. That's been built recently. 505 Sutton. That was Mr. Jimmy Francis. So that was Francis's family home. Forge House, Sir Gerald Barry and his wife. And of course they made him Sir after the Festival of Britain because he was Director General in 1951 and editor of the News Chronicle. And after that, several papers Commander John and Priscilla Burfield. These 2 cottages the other side of the road was Mrs. Pengelly, 501 in the right-hand side. She was a church warden. And Mr. and Mrs. Dick Francis, 502 on the left. The smithy. Now this is another new house. This was built by John and Priscilla Burfield. There's the old one of the old baker's ovens from the shop, been saved and put there. That's the wheelwright's shop, and that's the blacksmith shop. And and that's the doors to the blacksmith's shop from the road, which was normally left open. It was quite often a horse sticking out from there, in there for shoeing. Box Cottage, Mr. and Mrs. Spider Francis. Outside Privy. Here we come to the council houses as they were called. Number 1 was Ken and Elsie Francis. Number 2 was Mr. White. Number 3, Bert and Edie Francis. Number 4, Mr. and Mrs. Childs. He was Colonel Shiner's chauffeur. It was then Jack and Zena Bone, because she was daughter to the Childs. Number 5 was Frank and Mary Harwood, and number 6, Ern and Mrs. Rapson, Bunny Rapson. New Village Hall, built on the site of the old WI hut. And the old hut was built by Mr. Teddy Holding in the 1920s, I suppose. It was an old army hut. Ground at the back of the old village hall. Of course, we used that for growing vegetables at school children during the war. Millstone Cottage, then in Rita Charman. He was a shepherd for Tupper. And before the war, there was a young man, Morrow, lived in there. He got called up to the army, and he actually got killed on D-Days in the Coldstream Guards. Then, after the war, there was a flight Sergeant Cook. He got tragically killed on a training flight just after the war, and his wife was Doris Hare, daughter of Mr. Hare from the village shop. The millstones still on the side of the house. Beck Hall, bungalow, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy and Ruth Dundas. Ruth Dundas was one time president of WI. And her daughter, Mrs. Tony Green, has just been taken up the mantle and has taken on as president in this year 2000. That's the bungalow. Mr. and Mrs. Hennessy, White Horse, Mr. Albert Vile, and then Mr. Tom Payne, landlord, and then I think Mr. Everson was had the papers. Bus shelter. It was built in 1953 to commemorate the Queen's coronation. I remember, I wasn't here at the time. I was National Service in Germany then. Back at the White Horse again, because the bill barrels used to go in through the side there. Used to be, that's it, just there, under that window, there was 2 wooden doors, and they used to tie them back and they roll the barrels in. That's what they were tied back onto there. I think there was rings as well on the board one time for tethering horses. There's the bus shelter again. It's the seat we've had recently renovated, and we've put a time capsule in there with the pictures of people who built in the opening day, I think, and certain things put in there. So in a few hundred years' time, when someone pulls that to pieces, they'll have a pleasant surprise, perhaps. Now down towards Bignor Park, and the first place, the house we come to, is on the left here, was Albion House. Remember there was an old commander in there, I can't remember what his name was, and the lady who looked after him was French, and was just known in the village as Mademoiselle. The Croft, of course, this was Mr. Teddy Holding and his wife, May's house. Of course, he was a wonderful artist as well. I said before that he had the WI built, the old WI hut built, and his wife May, if she didn't start it, she was certainly a founder member of the WI in the village. Done an enormous amount of work in the village, for the village. Now we go down towards Bignor Park. The first cottage we come to is in the farm yard itself. Here we are. That was Mrs. Charman in Next house, which was recently was built then at the time, was Mr. and Mrs. Head, the head gardener. And the next house, I can know that Mr. Nightingale, and he was a brilliant gardener then, and he lived in it one. I can't recall who lived in there at the time I delivered papers, but the next one was Mr. Fiddler Miles and Mr. and Mrs. Cottrell. Of course, Bignor Park House itself, Viscountess Mersey. I've known 3 generations well of Viscounts and Viscountesses. Delivered the papers to the side door there, and to Mrs. Parfitt, who was the cook, and her husband was the chauffeur. Coming back to Sutton, Crossets, which was the old police cottage, Mr. and Mrs. Morris Moore. They had a son, Peter, who he gave me the paper round, and a daughter, Sheila, who was my May Queen in late 1942. Hurst Cottage. There was Mr. Jordan in there, and he was a newspaper editor or proprietor. It's a lovely cottage. The orchard, this was built by and lived in by Miss Holding and Miss Atkins, because Miss Holding was Teddy Holding's daughter, and they'd both done terrific amount of work for the village, and must have had a very large wardrobe, because they used to dress the children for school plays and the May Queens and all that sort of thing. Change of weather, we're back to winter season again. This is looking up towards about Upper Lavington Lane from the public house, and the first house on the left. It's a new house, and we come to Winters Hill, and that was also a new house, that built in the 1960s. The one before that was Finch's, in fact. I forgot to say it was Mr. and Mrs. Jeff Neal lives now. Fires. Mr. and Mrs. Martin Muncaster. Armstrong, I beg your pardon, Mr. and Mrs. Martin Armstrong. He was an author and BBC broadcaster. Farm Cottage, Mr. and Mrs. Underwood. They had 2 children, and a son and a daughter, and they took on the paper round from them. (515B) and 515C. Miss Fuchs rather, was in the right hand side, and then written on the other side was Cecil Davis, and Mrs. Cecil Davis, and Miss Thomas was in there at one time. Sutton Farm, first Miss Fuchs, and then Mr. and Mrs. Carroll. That's a concrete milk stand for that farm. The barn. Just looking up by Lavington Lane. Change of weather again, another season. This is spring now, I think. Danesview and Cottage. This is all new. I'm sorry it wasn't there at the time anyway when I delivered the Sunday papers. This is built on, there's the bungalow or the cottage as it's called. This has all been built on the field that sort of surrounded the men's club and reading rooms. Because the ground was used for sports on horticultural flower show day. There's tug of wars between the villages, and flower pot races, and George Gardner was the champion of that, nobody could beat him at that, and sack races, and egg and spoon races, and flat races. Of course, the men's reading room was situated here in the corner here on the ground. It was part of it still. There's part of it still. I think that's the part that was used for the public baths. It pays sixpence for a bath. There's actually a rifle range in there and snooker tables. Now this is another new house in the village, Stapleford's. Never quite understood why it's called Stapleford's, because it was a cottage next door, 515, that Mr. and Mrs. Stapleford lived in. Court Farm, Sutton Court Farm, is Mr. and Mrs. Archie Neal, and of course the son Jeff, he farmed it as well at the same time, and of course Mrs. Neal was churchwarden at the time, I think, and before that Mr. Neal had been churchwarden. It goes back to the 1920s, I think. The caves sheds at the back been turned into dwellings. Another view of the cave sheds. Nice bit of brick in wood on the back of the Sutton Court Farm. It's lovely, isn't it? Another barn in the farm itself. It's been turned into a dwelling in recent years. .515A. Now this is a rather nice cottage. This is the one that Mr. and Mrs. Stapleford lived in and worked on Sutton Court Farm. The aisles, Mr. and Mrs. Knowes. Remember, the house was on the right. The door was on the right hand side at that time. Well, there was a front door, but the side door was on the right. Foxcroft, and this was another two cottages. Right hand side was George and May Gardner, and on the left hand side Mr. and Mrs. Harwood. She delivered the other half. Daisy Francis done one half, and Mrs. Harwood done the other half with milk. She used to go with a milk churn and dish it out in a measurement of people's jugs. Fox Hill, this was another two cottages. Mr. Pedlar Palmer, and he was another council lensman. He used to cut the verges and the ditches, and on the right hand side was Mr. Killam's. I think there was a lot more wildflowers in when the verges were cut about 3 times a year or more. So instead of what we got now, there seems to have a lot of stinger nettles and things. Rose Cottage, this is one of 2 cottages. Mr. Len Bryant, who was their local shop baker. Interesting point here is that this is the second house that was rented by the shop from the Langenfield estate for workers for the village shop and bakery in the village. And on the left hand side, Mr. and Mrs. Edgerton and their sons. It's 512, I think, the number of that one. Sutton Gate, another 2 cottages. On the right hand side was Mr. and Mrs. Heather, Brad Heather as he was known, and on the left hand side Mr. Fermor, and then Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton, who are both Langenfield estate keepers. Greenfield, so this was built about the side 50s, early 50, I think it was completed. In number 1 was Mr. and Mrs. Woodley. In number 2, Mr. and Mrs. Cecil Davis. Number 3, Mr. and Mrs. Stone. Number 4, Mr. and Mrs. Coombs. Number 5, Tom and Gladys Turner. Number 6, George and May Gardner. Number 7, Mr. and Mrs. Bill Dunstan. Number 8, Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey. Of course, he, after he came out from the forces, served in the shop. Number 9, Bill and Renee King. Number 10, Mr. and Mrs. Maynard. And number 11, Mr. and Mrs. Laurie Varr. And number 12, Bill and Joan Merrick. Seem to have gone off on a bit of a tangent here with the tractor. Anyway, those are the pylons on the downs. Coming round now, that's Glatting Hanger. And this is as Farm Hill. That chestnut tree there was planted in 1977 to commemorate the Queen's 25 years. Because these were built afterwards, the two bungalows. Yeah, that's the tree again, that's the chestnut tree that was planted. Sort of thing, don't do much to the landscape. Ignore that. This is the end of Barlavington Lane, down towards where it joins Folly Lane. Folly Lane. So on the left, Chalky Road, Chalky Lane, which goes to the dog kennels, all up. You walk up through the Burkett and down through Barlavington Hanger and past the cuckoo tree. There's a nice hollow in the Folly Lane, Folly Cottage. Mr. Tell lived there. He was known for renovating springs at Barlavington and also Rose Cottage. Turned that into one house from two cottages. Aslan's Farm, Mr. and Mrs. Nordrett. And then there's nice watercress beds at the back there, because that's where the stream, the Sutton End stream, sort of starts in this area. Tainfield House. Now that's the last, this is the last house on my paper round. That's the house itself. And then cycle back to the White Horse. Not to drink, as you might think, but to change my coppers, which I collected, into silver, or maybe get one 10-shilling note. The landlord seemed quite pleased to have the small change and to give me the service. Paper rain must have taken me more than 2 hours, so there was a lot of talking, and I read most of the papers. Houses and cottages 50 years ago, this year being 2000, don't seem to have changed too much in appearance. Residents have, of course. There's far more sort of manual workers, craftsmen and tradesmen. Can only recall one weekender. So mustn't digress, or I'll be in trouble. Thank you for viewing and listening. I apologise for my many mistakes. Till next time, goodbye.